Okay, well, I'm here, sorta. My model is dealing with delay and disconnections, which, you know, it wouldn't be one of my streams without a lot of scuff, honestly. I do have Blurp turned on. If anyone wants to use it to try to distract me or just play random noises because it's fun. But I'm here, I'm live-ish, and it is Fairy Tale Friday. I'm not drinking alcohol this time, I'm drinking sangria-flavored soda. So I apologize ahead of time before any belches may happen. This blurp's gonna work. I haven't heard the sound alert yet. Oh, there it is. But yeah, those are running. I might hear them. I might not. I've got them turned fairly loud. I wonder why I didn't hear that much. But I do have it set that the sounds don't go on the VOD because, well, it's Fairy Tale Friday and I have to get the fairy tales recorded. So, we're all about that stuff, huh? So let us go ahead and skip over so I can introduce the new book. Because we are going into the Green Fairy book. Yes, number 3 in the fairy book series. And there's a series, well, it's not technically 3, because he did the first 2, then he did book poetry. Then they went back to fairy tales. So we're going to be getting into the Green Fairy book today. I will read the introduction that he wrote in it, because his introduction, he mistakenly says that this should be the last of the books. Little does he realize at this point in time that it ended up being somewhere around 20, maybe more. But yeah. And depending on how things work, I may try streaming from my tower next week. Or over the weekend, depending on how I feel. Because my tower does not get the best internet signal in this house. So, if I can get a decent signal back there and it stays powered on, because the motherboard is a little on the jacked up side, I will try to stream from it instead of the laptop. Fortunately, everything I have is easily transferable between the two. And those of you on the other channel, no, let me do it this way just for the hell of it. Okay. So, we are getting into the Green Fairy book this week. It is a different book. And if you've listened to me for a long time, you probably know a lot of the fairy tales because I've read other books that have the same fairy tales in them. But I'm doing this as part of the Andrew Lang series on YouTube, so I'm getting into the third book. And I will say that this has some stories that, well, if you think about it, this book was originally written roughly 2 centuries ago. Well, 1 century ago. Let me just look to see what the date is on the book, shall we? Okay. This book was first published in 1892. So, yeah. Over a century. In 1892 by Longmans, Green and Company in England, of course. And this one has... Of course, the stories aren't numbered. Don't think it has as many stories as the last one did, so this one has longer stories. Ooh, 3 little pigs in this book. Nice. As its fairy gifts. So we will see how many stories we can get through in the allotted time we have. And since it's already 9:10 by my clock, I'm going to go ahead and get into this one. So, let us start with the introduction. Introduction. To the friendly reader. This is the third and probably the last of the fairy books with many colors. First there was the blue fairy book, then children, you asked for more, and we made up the red fairy book. And when you wanted still more, the green fairy book was put together. The stories in all the books were borrowed from many countries. Some are French, some German, some Russian, some Italian, some Scottish, some English, and one Chinese. However, much of these nations differ about trifles. They all agree in liking fairy tales. The reason, no doubt, is that men were much like children in their minds long ago. And so before they took to writing newspapers and sermons and novels and long poems, they told each other stories, such as you read in the fairy books. They believed that witches could turn people into beasts, that beasts could speak, that magic rings could make their owners invisible, and all the other wonders in the stories. Then, as the world became grown up, the fairy tales, which were not written down, would have been quite forgotten, but that old grannies remembered them, and told them to the little grandchildren. And when they, in turn, became grannies, they remembered them and told them also. In this way, these tales are older than reading and writing, far older than printing. The oldest fairy tales ever written down were written down in Egypt, about Joseph's time, nearly 3,500 years ago. Other fairy tales Homer knew in Greece, nearly 3,000 years ago, and he made them all up into a poem, the Odyssey, which I hope you will read someday. Here you will find the witch who turns men into swine, and the man who bores out the big, foolish giant's eye, and the cap of darkness, and the shoes of swiftness, that were worn later by Jack the Giant Killer. These fairy tales are the oldest stories in the world, and they are the first made by men who were childlike for their own amusement. So they amuse children still, and also grown-up people who have not forgotten how they were once children. Some of the stories were made, no doubt, not only to amuse, but to teach goodness. You see, in these tales, how the boy who is kind to beasts, and polite and generous, and brave, always becomes best through his trials. And no doubt these tales were meant to make their hearers kind, unselfish, courteous, and courageous. This is the moral of them, but after all, we think more as we read them of the diversion than of the lesson. These are grown-ups who now say the stories are not good for children, because they are not true, because there are no witches, nor talking beasts. And because people are killed in them, especially wicked giants. But probably you read the tales and know very well how much is true and how much is only make believe. And I never yet heard a child who killed a very tall man merely because Jack killed the giants. Or who was unkind to a stepmother, if he had one, because in the fairy tales a stepmother is often disagreeable. If there are frightful monsters in fairy tales, they do not frighten you now, because that kind of monster is no longer going about the world, whatever he may be have done long, long ago. He has been turned into stone, and you may see his remains in museums. Therefore, I am afraid you will be afraid of the magicians and dragons. Besides, you see that a really brave boy or girl was always their master, even in the height of their power. Some of the tales here, like the half chick, are for very little children. Others are for older ones. The longest tales, like Heart of Ice, were not invented when the others were, but were written in French by clever men and women such as Madame Audenoy and the Count de Caylus about 200 years ago. There are not many people now, perhaps there were none, who can write really good fairy tales, because they do not believe enough in their own stories, because they want to be the writer that has pleased heaven to make them. So here we give you the last of the old stories, for the present, and hope you will like them and feel grateful to the Brothers Grimm, who took them down from the telling of old women, and to M. Celibot and M. Charles Morales, who have lent us some tales from their own French people, and to Mr. Ford, who drew the pictures, and to the ladies, Miss Blackley, Miss Alma Eileen, Miss Eleanor Sellar, Miss Maysower, Miss Wright, and Mrs. Lang, who translated many of the tales out of the French, German, and other languages. If we have a book for you next year, it shall not be a fairy book. What it is to be a secret, and we hope that it will not be dull. So goodbye, and when you have read a fairy book, lend it to other children who have none, and tell them the stories in your own way, which is a very pleasant mode of passing the time. Hi, Guilty! Let's start with Scooby, huh? Ugh. Yes, there are many buttons now. There's even a TTS if you want to try it, but it requires bits. Because I do have the Blurp TTS, because I'm apparently one of the beta testers for it. Playing live audience. Yeah, I've kind of got an extension like the ones for 7 days that should pop up on the right hand side of the screen. But it requires bits to do that one, so. If I can find a decent TTS that doesn't require bits, I may try it. But I also have to get my Raven rigged up, so. Because, the whole thought about getting a TTS pet, that's just kind of fun. And I got the program for it, because I spent Christmas money to get the program for it, then I realized I don't have any TTS programs to use with it. And I've got a model, but the model doesn't work with the program I got, so kind of a pain. And then there's Kel, who just post things. Let's see. What's the book do? There it is. Yeah, I don't know why I put that as the command for it. But trying to distract me while I'm trying to read is going to be fun. And it's really hard to keep a straight face when all of a sudden you're reading and Scooby-Doo comes on. But those are there to see if I can be distracted. At least it'll get my attention to read chat every now and then. And of course, the first story in this book has singing. Yay me. I guess a story about a bird requires singing. So anyway, the first actual story for the night, and the first actual story for the book. The Bluebird. Once upon a time there lived a king who was immensely rich. He had broad lands and sacks overflowing with gold and silver, but he did not care a bit for all his riches because the queen, his wife, was dead. He shut himself up in a little room and knocked his head against the walls for grief, until his courtiers were very afraid that he would hurt himself. So they hung feather beds between the tapestries in the wall, and then he could go on knocking his head as long as it was any consolation to him, without coming to much harm. All his subjects came to see him and said whatever they thought would comfort him. Some were grave, even gloomy with him, and some agreeable, even gay. But no one could make the least impression on him. Indeed, he hardly seemed to hear what they say. At last a lady came who was wrapped in a black mantle and seemed to be in the deepest grief. She wept and sobbed until the king's attention was attracted, and when she said that, far from coming to try to diminish his grief, she, who had just lost a good husband, was come to add her tears to his, since she knew what he must be feeling. The king redoubled his lamentations. Then he told the sorrowful lady long stories about the good qualities of his departed queen, and she in turn recounted all the virtues of her departed husband. And this passed the time so agreeably that the king quite forgot to thump his head against the feather beds, and he and the lady did not need to wipe the tears from her great blue eyes as often as before. By degrees, they came to talking about other things in which the king took an interest, and in a wonderfully short time the whole kingdom was astonished by the news that the king was married again to the sorrowful lady. Now, the king had one daughter, who was just 15 years old. Her name was Fiordilisa, and she was the prettiest and most charming princess imaginable, always gay and merry. The new queen, who also had a daughter, very soon sent for her to come to the palace. Storyteller was her name, and had been brought up by her godmother, the fairy Mazilla. But in spite of all the care bestowed upon her, she was neither beautiful nor gracious. Indeed, when the queen saw how ill-tempered and ugly she appeared beside Fiordilisa, she was in despair, and did everything in her power to turn the king against his own daughter, in the hope that he might take a fancy to Storyteller. One day the king said that it was time Fiordilisa and Storyteller were married, so he would give one of them to the first suitable prince who visited his court. The queen answered, My daughter certainly ought to be the first to be married. She is older than yours, and 1,000 times more charming. The king, who hates disputes, said, "Very well, it's no affair of mine. Settle it in your own way." Very soon after the news came that King Charming, who was the most handsome and magnificent prince in all the country around, was on his way to visit the king. As soon as the queen heard this, she set all her jewelers, tailors, weavers, embroiderers to work upon splendid dresses and ornaments for Turritella. But she told the king that Fiordalisa had no need of anything new, and the night before the king was to arrive, she bribed her waiting woman to steal away all the princess's dresses and jewels, so that on the day when it came, and Fiordalisa wished to adorn herself as became her high rank, had not even a ribbon to find. Easily as you could have guessed, she had played the trick. She made no complaint, but sent to the merchants for some rich stuffs. But they said that the queen had expressly forbidden them to supply her with any, and they dared not to disobey. So the princess had nothing left to put on but the white frock that she had been wearing the day before, and dressed in that she went down when the time of the king's arrival came, and sat in a corner, hoping to escape notice. The queen received her guest with great ceremony, and presented him to her daughter, who was gorgeously attired, but so much splendor only made her ugliness more noticeable, and the king, after one glance at her, looked the other way. The queen, however, only thought that he was bashful, and took pains to keep Turritella in full view. King Charming, when he asked if there was not another princess, one named Fiordalisa. "Yes," said Turritella, pointing with her finger. "There she is, trying to keep out of sight because she is not smart." At this, Fiordalisa blushed, and looked so shy and so lovely that the king was fairly astonished. He rose, and bowing low before her, said, "Madam, your incomparable beauty needs no adornment." "Sire," answered the princess, "I assure you that I am not in the habit of wearing dresses as crumpled and untidy as this one, so I should have been better pleased if you had not seen me at all." "Impossible!" cried King Charming. "Wherever such a marvelously beautiful princess appears, I can look at nothing else." Here the queen broke in, saying sharply, "I assure you, sire, that Fiordalisa is vain enough already. Pray make her no more flattering speeches." The king quite understood that she was not pleased, but that did not matter to him, so he admired Fiordalisa to his heart's content, and talked to her for 3 hours without stopping. The queen was in despair, and so was Turritella, when they saw how much the king preferred Fiordalisa. They complained bitterly to the king, and begged and teased him until he at least consented to have the princess shut up somewhere out of sight while King Charming's visit lasted. So that night she went to her room and was seized by 4 masked figures and carried up to the topmost room of the high tower, where they left her in the deepest dejection. So easily guessed that she was not to be kept from sight for fear the king should fall in love with her. But then how disappointing that was, for she already liked him very much, and would have been quite willing to be chosen for his bride. As King Charming did not know what had happened to the princess, he looked forward impatiently to meeting her again, and he retired to talk about her with the other courtiers when they were placed in attendance with him. But by the queen's orders they would say nothing good of her, but declared that she was vain, capricious, and bad-tempered, and that she tormented her waiting maids, and that, in spite of all the money that the king gave her, she was so mean that she preferred to go out dressed like a poor shepherdess rather than spend any of it. All these things vexed the king very much, and he was silent. Is it true, he thought, that she is so very poorly dressed, but then she is so ashamed that it proves that she is not accustomed to be so? I cannot believe that, with that lovely face, that she can be ill-tempered and contemptible, as they say. No, the queen must be jealous of her for the sake of that ugly daughter of hers, and so these evil reports are spread. The courtiers could not help seeing that what they had told the king did not please him, and one of them cunningly began to praise Fiordalicia when he could talk to the king without being heard by the others. King Charming thereupon became so cheerful and interested in all he said that it was easy to guess how much he admired the princess. So when the queen sent for the courtiers and questioned them all about what he had found out, the report confirmed her worst fears. As to the poor Princess Fiordalisa, she cried all night without stopping. It would have been quite bad to be shut up in this gloomy tower before I had seen the King Charming, she said. But now, when he is here and is enjoying themselves without them, it is so unkind. The next day, the Queen and King Charming the Queen sent King Charming splendid presents of jewelry and rich stuffs, and among other things, an ornament made expressly in honor of the approaching wedding. It was a heart cut out of one huge ruby, and was surrounded by several diamond arrows, and one piercing it. A golden true lover's knot above the heart bore the motto, "But one can wound me," and the whole jewel was hung upon a chain of immense pearls. Never since the world has been a world had such a thing been made, and the king was quite amazed when it was presented to him. The page who brought it begged him to accept it from the princess, who chose him to be her knight. "What?" cried he. "Does the lovely Princess Fiordalisa design to think of me as admirable and encouraging way?" "You confuse the names, sire," said the page hastily. "I come on behalf of Princess Storyteller." "Oh, this is Storyteller who wishes me to be her knight," said the king coldly. "I am sorry I cannot accept the honor." And he sent the splendid gifts back to the queen and Storyteller, who were furiously angry at the contempt with which they were treated. As soon as he possibly could, King Charming went to see the king and queen, and as he entered the hall, he looked for Fiordalisa, and every time anyone came in, he started around to see who it was, and was altogether so uneasy and dissatisfied that the queen saw it plainly. But she would not take any notice, and talked of nothing but the entertainments she was planning. The prince answered at random, and presently asked if it was to not to have the pleasure of seeing Princess Fiordalisa. "Sire," answered the queen haughtily, "her father has ordered that she shall not leave her own apartments until my daughter is married." "What can be the reason for keeping that lovely princess a prisoner?" cried the king in great indignation. "That I do not know," answered the queen, "and even if I did, I might not feel bound to tell you." The king was terribly angry at being thwarted like this. He felt certain that Storyteller was to blame for it. So casting a furious glance at her, he abruptly took leave of the queen and returned to his own apartments. There he said to a young squire whom he had brought with him, "I will give all I have in this world to gain the goodwill of one such as the princess's waiting women, and retain a moment's speech with Fiordalicia. "Nothing could be easier," said the young squire, and he very soon made friends with one of the ladies, who told him that in the evening Fiordalisa would be at a little window which looked out onto the garden, where he could come by and talk to her. "Only," she said, "he must take great care not to be seen, as it would be as much as her place was worth to be caught helping King Charming to see the princess." The squire was delighted, and promised all she asked. But the moment he had run off to announce his success to the king, a false waiting woman went and told the queen all that had passed. She at once determined that her own daughter should be at the little window, and she taught her so well all she had to say and do, that even the stupid Turritella could make no mistake. The night was so dark that the king had not a chance of finding out the trick was being played upon him, so he approached the window with the greatest delight, and said everything that he had been longing to say to Fiordalisa to persuade her of his love for her. Turritella answered that she had been taught, that she was very unhappy, and that there was no chance of her being better treated by the queen until her daughter was married. And the king entreated her to marry him, and thereupon he drew a ring from his finger and put it on Turritella's. And she answered him as well as she could. The king could not help thinking that she did not say exactly why he would have expected this from darling Fiordalisa, but he persuaded himself that the fear of being surprised by the queen was making her awkward and unnatural. He would not leave her until she had promised to see him again that next night, which Turritella did willingly enough. The queen was overjoyed at the success of her stratagem, and promised herself that all would be as she wished. And sure enough, as soon as it was dark the following night, the king came, and bringing with him a chariot which he had been given by an enchanter, who was his friend. The chariot was drawn by flying frogs, and the king easily persuaded Turritella to come out and let him put her into it. Then, mounting beside her, he cried triumphantly, "Now, my princess, you are free. Where will it please you that we shall hold our wedding?" And Turritella, with her head muffled by her mantle, answered that Fairy Mozilla was her godmother, and that she would like it to be at her castle. So the king told the frogs, who had a map of the world in their heads, and very soon he and Turritella were set down at the castle of Fairy Mozilla. The king would certainly have found out his mistake the moment they stepped from the brilliantly lighted castle, but Turritella held her mantle more closely around her, and asked to see the fairy by herself, and quickly told her all that happened, and how she had succeeded in deceiving King Charming. "Ah, my daughter," said the fairy, "I see we have no easy task before us. He loves Fiordalisa so much that he will not be easily pacified. I feel sure he will defy us." Meanwhile, the king was waiting in a splendid room with diamond walls, so clear that he could see the fairy and Turritella as they stood whispering together, and he was very much puzzled. "Who can have betrayed us?" he said to himself. "How comes our enemy here? She must be plotting to prevent our marriage. Why doesn't my lovely Fiordalisa make haste and come back to me?" But it was worse than anything he had imagined when the Fairy Mozilla entered, leading Turritella by the hand, and said to him, "Prince Charming, here is the Princess Turritella, to whom you have plighted your faith. Let us have the wedding at once." "Ah!" cried the king. "I marry that little creature? What do you take me for? I've promised her nothing." Say no more. Have you no respect for a fairy? Answered she angrily. Yes, ma'am, answered the king. I am prepared to respect you as much as a fairy can be respected. But if you will give me back my princess... I am not here, interrupted Turritella. Here is the ring you gave me. With whom did you talk in the little window if it was not with me? What? Cried the king angrily. Have I been altogether deceived and deluded? Where is my chariot? Not another moment will I stay here. Oh, said the fairy, not so fast. And she touched his feet, which immediately became as firmly fixed to the floor as if they had been nailed there. Oh, do whatever you like with me, said the king. He may turn me to stone, but I will marry no one but Fiordalisa. And not another word would he say, though the fairy scolded and threatened, and Turritella wept and raged for 20 days and 20 nights. At last the fairy Mozilla said furiously, for she was quite tired of his obstinacy, Choose whether you will marry my goddaughter or do penance 7 years for breaking your word to her. And the king cried gaily, Pray do whatever you like with me, as long as you deliver me from this ugly scold. Wow. Scold? Cried Turritella. Who are you? I should like to know that you dare call me a scold. A miserable king who breaks his word and goes about in a chariot drawn by croaking frogs out of a marsh. Let us have no more of these insults, cried the fairy. Fly from that window, ungrateful king, and for 7 years be a bluebird. As she spoke, the king's face altered. His arms turned to wings, his feet into little crooked black claws. In a moment he had a slender body like a bird, covered with shining blue feathers. His beak was like ivory, his eyes were bright as stars, and a crown of white feathers adorned his head. As soon as the transformation was complete, the king uttered a dolorous cry and fled through the open window, pursued by the mocking laughter of Turritella and the fairy Mozilla. He flew on until he reached the thickest part of the wood, and there, perched upon a cypress tree, he bewailed his miserable fate. Alas, in 7 years who knows what may happen to my darling Fiordalisa, he said. Her cruel stepmother may have married her to someone else before I am myself again. And then what good will life be to me? In the meantime, the fairy Mozilla had sent Turritella back to the queen, who was all anxiety to know how the wedding had gone off. But when her daughter arrived and told her all that had happened, she was terribly angry. And, of course, her wrath fell upon Fiordalisa. She shall have cause to repent that the king admires her, said the queen, nodding her head meaningly. And then she and Turritella went up to the little room in the tower where the princess was imprisoned. Fiordalisa was immensely surprised to see that Turritella was wearing a royal mantle and a diamond crown, and her heart sank when the queen said, My daughter has come to show you some of her wedding presents, for she is King Charming's bride. And they are to be the happiest pair in the world. He loves her to distraction. All this time, Turritella was spreading out lace and jewels and rich brocades and ribbons before Fiordalisa's unwilling eyes, and taking good care to display King Charming's ring, which she wore upon her thumb. The princess recognized it as soon as her eyes fell upon it, and after that she could no longer doubt that he had indeed married Turritella, and cried in despair, Take away these miserable gods! What pleasure has a wretched captive in the sight of them? And then she fell insensible upon the floor, And the cruel queen laughed maliciously and went away with Turritella, leaving her there without comfort or aid. That night the queen said to the king that his daughter was so infatuated with King Charming, in spite of his never having shown any preference for her at all, that it is just as well that she should stay in the tower till she came for her senses. To which he answered that it was her affair, and she could give what orders she pleased about the princess. When the unhappy Fiordalisa recovered and remembered all that she had just heard, she began to cry bitterly, believing that King Charming was lost to her forever, and all night long she sat at her open window, sighing and lamenting. But when it was dawn, she crept away into the darkest corner of the little room and sat there, too unhappy to care about anything. As soon as night came again, she once more leaned out into the darkness and bewailed her miserable lot. Now, it happened that King Charming, or rather the Bluebird, had been flying around the palace in hope of seeing his beloved princess, but had dared not go too near the window for fear of being seen and recognized by Turritella. When night fell, he had not succeeded in discovering where Fiordalisa was imprisoned, and, weary and sad, he perched upon a branch in a tall fir tree which grew close to the tower, and began to sing himself to sleep. But soon as the soft voice lamenting attracted his attention, and listening intently, he could hear it say, "Cruel queen, what have I ever done to be imprisoned like this? And I am not unhappy enough before, that you must need come and taunt me with your happiness of your daughter, who is enjoying now she is the King Charming's bride." The Bluebird, greatly surprised, waited impatiently for the dawn, and the moment it was light he flew off to see who it was who had been speaking thus. But he found the window shut, and could see no one. The next night, however, he was on the watch, and by the clear moonlight he saw that the sorrowful lady at the window was Fiordalisa herself. "My princess, have I at last found you?" he said, alighting close to her. "Speaking to me?" cried the princess in great surprise. "Only a moment since you mentioned my name, and now you do not know me, Fiordalisa," he said sadly. "But no wonder, since I am nothing but a bluebird, and will remain one for 7 years." "What? Little Bluebird, are you really the King Charming?" said the princess, caressing him. "It is true," he answered. "For being faithful to you I am thus punished, but believe me, if it were twice as long, I would bear it joyfully rather than give you up." "Oh, what are you telling me?" cried the princess. "Has not your bride Turritella just visited me, wearing a royal mantle and diamond crown you gave her? I cannot be mistaken, for I saw your ring upon her thumb." Then the Bluebird was furiously angry and told the princess all that had happened, and how he had been deceived into carrying off Turritella, and how, for refusing to marry her, the fairy Mozilla had condemned him to be a bluebird for 7 years. The princess was very happy when she heard how faithful her lover was, and would never have tired of hearing his love speeches and explanations. But too soon the sun rose, and they had to part lest the Bluebird should be discovered. After promising to come again to the princess's window as soon as it was dark, he flew away and hid himself in a little hole in the fir tree, while Fiordalisa remained devoured by anxiety lest he should be caught in a trap or eaten up by an eagle. But the Bluebird did not stay long in his hiding place. He flew away and away, until he came to his own palace, and got into it through a broken window. And there he found the cabinet where his jewels were kept, and chose out of those a splendid diamond ring as a present for the princess. By the time he got back, Fiordalisa was sitting waiting for him by the open window, And when he gave her the ring, she scolded him gently for having run such a risk to get it for her. "Promise me that you will wear it always," said the bluebird. And the princess promised it on condition that he should come to see her in the day as well as by the night. They talked all night long, and the next morning the bluebird flew off to his kingdom and crept into the palace through the broken window, and chose from his treasures 2 bracelets, each cut out of a single emerald. When he presented them to the princess, she shook her head at him reproachfully and said, "Do you think that I love you so little that I need all these gifts to remind me of you?" And he answered, "No, my princess, but I love you so much I feel I cannot express it, try as I may. I only bring you these worthless trifles to show that I have not ceased to think of you, though I have been obliged to leave you for a time." The following night he gave Fiordelisa a watch set in a single pearl. The princess laughed a little when she saw it and said, "You may well give me a watch, for since I have known you I have lost the power of measuring time. The hours you spend with me pass like minutes, and the hours that I drag through without you seem like years." "Ah, princess, they cannot seem so long to you as they do to me," he answered. Day by day he brought more beautiful things for the princess, diamonds and rubies and opals, and at night she decked herself with them to please him, but by the day she hid them away in her straw mattress. When the sun shone, the bluebird, hidden in the tall fir tree, sang to her so sweetly that all the passers-by wondered, and said that the wood was inhabited by spirits. And so 2 years slipped away, and still the princess was a prisoner, and Storyteller was not married. The queen had offered her hand to all the neighboring princes, but they always answered that they would marry Fiordelisa with pleasure, but not Storyteller on any account. This displeased the queen terribly. "Fiordelisa must be in league with him to annoy me," she said. "Let us go and accuse her of it." So she and Storyteller went up to the tower. Now it happened that it was nearly midnight, and Fiordelisa, all decked out with jewels, was sitting in the window with the bluebird. And as the queen passed outside to the door to listen, she heard the princess and her lover singing together a little song he had just taught her. These are the words. "What a luckless pair are we, one in a prison, one in a tree. All our trouble and anguish come from our faithless spoiling of our enemies' gain. But vainly they practice their cruel arts, for naught can sever our 2 fond hearts." They sound melancholy, perhaps, but the 2 voices sang them gaily enough, and the queen burst to open the door, crying, "Ah, my Storyteller, there is some treachery going on here!" As soon as she saw her, Fiordelisa, with great presence of mind, hastily shut her little window, that the bluebird might have time to escape, and then turned to meet the queen, who overwhelmed her with a torrent of reproaches. "Your intrigues are discovered, madam," she said furiously, "and you need not hope that your high rank will save you from the punishment you deserve." "And with whom do you accuse me of intriguing, madam?" asked the princess. "Have I not seen your prisoner for 2 years? And have I not seen except the jailers sent by you?" When she spoke, the queen and Storyteller were looking at her in the greatest surprise, perfectly dazzled by her beauty and the splendor of all her jewels. And the queen said, "One may ask, madam, where did you get all these diamonds? Perhaps you mean to tell me that you discovered a mine of them in the tower?" "I certainly did find them here," answered the princess. "And pray," said the queen, her wrath increasing at every moment, "for whom's admiration are you decked out like this, since I have often seen you not half as fine as the most important occasions at court?" "For my own," answered Fiordalisa. "You must admit that I have plenty of time on my hands, so you cannot be surprised at my spending some of it in making myself smart." "That's all very fine," said the queen suspiciously. "I think I will look out and see for myself." So she and Turritella began to search every corner of the little room, and when they came to the straw mattress, out fell such a quantity of pearls, diamonds, rubies, opals, emeralds, and sapphires that they were amazed, and could not tell what to think. But the queen resolved to hide somewhere a false packet of letters to prove that the princess had been conspiring with the king's enemies, and she chose the chimney as a good place. Fortunately for Fiordalisa, this was exactly where the bluebird had perched himself, to keep an eye upon her proceedings, and to try to avert danger from his beloved princess, and now cried, "Beware, Fiordalisa! Your false enemy is plotting against you!" False enemy? The strange voice so frightened the queen that she took the letter and went hastily away with Turritella, and they held a council to try and devise some means of finding out what fairy or enchanter was favoring the princess. At last they sent one of the queen's maids to wait upon Fiordalisa, and told her to pretend to be quite stupid, and to see or hear nothing, when she was really to watch the princess day and night, and to keep the queen informed of her doings. Poor Fiordalisa, who guessed that she was sent as a spy, was in despair, and cried bitterly that she dared not see her dear bluebird for fear that some evil might happen to him if he were discovered. The days were so long and the nights so dull, but for a whole month she never went near her little window lest he could fly to her as he used to do. However, at last the spy, who had never taken her eyes off the princess day or night, was so overcome with weariness that she fell into a deep sleep. And as soon as the princess saw that, she flew to her window and opened it and cried softly, "Bluebird, blue as the sky, fly to me now, there's nobody by." And the bluebird, who had never ceased to flutter around within sight, fearing of her prison, came in an instant. They had so much to say and were so overjoyed to meet once more that they scarcely seemed to them 5 minutes before the sun rose, and the bluebird had to fly away. But the next night the spy slept as soundly as before, so that the bluebird came, and he and the princess began to think they were perfectly safe, and to make all sorts of plans for being happy as long as they were before the queen's visit. But alas, the third night the spy was not quite so sleepy, and when the princess opened her window and cried as usual, "Bluebird, blue as the sky, fly to me now, there's nobody by," she was wide awake in a moment, though she was sly enough to keep her eyes shut at first. But presently she heard voices, and peeping cautiously she saw by the moonlight the most lovely bluebird in the world, who was talking to the princess while she stroked and caressed it fondly. The spy did not lose a single word of the conversation, and as soon as the day dawned, the bluebird had reluctantly said goodbye to the princess and rushed off to the queen and told her all that she had seen and heard. Then the queen sent for Turritella, and they talked it over, and very soon came to the conclusion that this bluebird was no other than King Charming himself. What an insolent princess!" cried the queen. "To think that when we were supposed to be so miserable, she was all the possible time with that false king. But I know we can get revenge ourselves somehow." So the spy was ordered to go back, and to pretend to sleep as soundly as ever. And indeed she went to bed earlier than usual and snored as naturally as possible. But the poor princess ran to the window and cried, "Bluebird, blue as the sky, fly to me now, there's nobody by." But no bird came. All night long she called and waited and listened, but there was still no answer. For the cruel queen had caused the fir tree to be hung all over with knives, swords, razors, shears, billhooks, and sickles, so that when the bird heard her call and flew towards her, his wings were cut, and his little black feet clipped off, and pierced and stabbed in 20 places, and fell back bleeding into his hiding place in the tree, and lay there groaning in despair, for he thought the princess must have been persuaded to betray him to regain her liberty. "Ah, Fiordalisa, can you indeed be so lovely and so faithless," he sighed, "that I may as well die at once." And he turned over on his side and began to die. But as it happened that his friend the enchanter had been very much alarmed at seeing the frog chariot come back to him without King Charming, and had been round the world 8 times seeking him, but without success. At the very moment when the king gave himself up to despair, he was passing through the wood for the 8th time and called, as he had done all over the world, "Charming! King Charming! Are you here?" The king at once recognized his friend's voice and answered very faintly, "I am here." The enchanter looked all around him but could see nothing. Then the king said again, "I am a bluebird." Then the enchanter found him in an instant, and seeing his pitiable condition, ran hither and thither without a word, until he had collected a handful of magic herbs, with which, and a few cantations, he speedily made the king whole and sound again. "Now," he said, "let me hear all about it. There must be a princess at the bottom of this." Isn't there always? "There are 2, answered King Charming with a wry smile. And then he told the whole story, accusing Fiordalisa of having betrayed the secret of his visits to make her peace with the queen, and indeed saying a great many things about her fickleness and her deceitful beauty, and so on. The enchanter quite agreed with him, and went even further, declaring that all the princesses were alike, except perhaps in the matter of beauty, and advised him to have done with Fiordalisa and forget all about her. But somehow or other his advice did not quite please the king. "What is to be done next?" asks the enchanter, "since you have still 5 years to remain a bluebird." "Take me to your palace," answered the king. "There you can at least keep me in a cage safe from cats and swords." "Well, that is the best thing to do for the present," said his friend. "But I am not an enchanter for nothing. I'm sure to have a brilliant idea for you before long." In the meantime, Fiordalisa, quite in despair, sat at her window day and night, calling out for her dear bluebird in vain, imagining over and over again all the terrible things that could have happened to him, until she grew quite pale and thin. As for the queen and Storyteller, they were triumphant, but their triumph was short, for the king, Fiordalisa's father, fell ill and died, and all the people rebelled against the queen and Storyteller, and came in a body to the palace, demanding Fiordalisa. The queen came upon the balcony with threats and haughty words, so that they at last thought they lost their patience, and broke open the doors of the palace, one of which fell back on the queen and killed her. Storyteller fled for the fairy Mazilla, and all the nobles of the kingdom fetched the Princess Fiordalisa from her prison in the tower, and made her queen. Very soon, with all the care and attention they bestowed upon her, she recovered from the effects of her long captivity, and looked more beautiful than ever, and was able to take counsel with her courtiers, and arrange for the governing of her kingdom during her absence. And then, taking a bag full of jewels, she set out alone to look for the bluebird, without telling anyone where she was going. Meanwhile, the enchanter was taking care of King Charming, but as his power was not great enough to counteract the fairy Mazilla's, he at least had resolved to go and see if he could make new terms for her with his friend. For you see, fairies and enchanters are cousins of a sort. After all, after knowing one another for 500 or 600 years and falling out, and making up pretty often, they understand one another well enough. True. So the fairy Mazilla received him graciously. "And what may be you wanting, gossip?" she said. "You can do a good turn for me if you will," he answered. "A king who is a friend of mine was unlucky enough to offend you." "Ah, I know what you mean," interrupted the fairy. "I'm sorry not to oblige you, gossip, but you need to expect no mercy from me unless he will marry my goddaughter, whom you see yonder looking so pretty and charming. Let him think it over, what I say." The enchanter hadn't a word to say, for he thought Storyteller was frightful. But he could not go away without making one more effort for his friend, the king, who was really in great danger as long as he lived in a cage. Indeed, already he had met with several alarming accidents. Once the nail on which his cage was hung had given way, and his feathered majesty was suffered much from the fall, while Madame Puss, who happened to be in the room at the time, had given him a scratch on the eye which came very near to blinding him. Another time they had forgotten to give him any water to drink, so that he was nearly dead of thirst. And the worst thing of all was that he was in danger of losing his kingdom, for he had been absent so long that all of his subjects began to believe him dead. So considering all these things, the enchanter agreed with the fairy Mazilla that she should restore the king to his natural form, and should take Storyteller to stay at his palace for several months, and if after the time was over he still could not make up his mind to marry her, he should be once more turned into a bluebird. Then the fairy dressed Storyteller with a magnificent gold and silver robe, and they mounted together upon a flying dragon, and very soon reached King Charming's palace, where he, too, had just been brought by his faithful friend, the enchanter. 3 strokes of the fairy's wand restored his natural form, and he was as handsome and delightful as ever. But he considered that he paid dearly for his restoration when he caught sight of Storyteller, and the mere idea of marrying her made him shudder. Meanwhile, Queen Fiordalisa, disguised as a poor peasant girl, wearing a great straw hat that concealed her face, and carrying an old sack over her shoulder, had set out upon her weary journey, and had travelled far, sometimes by sea and sometimes by land, sometimes on foot and sometimes on horseback, but not knowing which way to go. She feared all the time that every step she took was leading her further away from her lover. One day, as she sat quiet, tired, and sad, on the bank of a little brook, cooling her white feet in the clear running water, and combing her long hair that glittered like gold in the sunshine, a little bent old woman passed by, leaning on a stick. She stopped and said to Fiordalisa, "What, my pretty child, are you alone?" "Indeed, good mother, I am too sad to care for company," she answered, and the tears ran down her cheeks. "Oh, don't cry," said the old woman, "but tell me truly what is the matter. Perhaps I can help you." The queen told her willingly all that had happened, and how she was seeking the bluebird. Thereupon the little old woman suddenly stood up straight, and grew tall and young and beautiful, and said with a smile to the astonished Fiordalisa, "Lovely queen, the king with whom you seek is no longer a bird. My sister Mazilla has given him back his own form, and he is in his own kingdom. Do not be afraid, you will reach him and will prosper. Take these 4 eggs. If you break one when you are in great difficulty, you will find aid." So saying, she disappeared. And Fiordalisa, feeling much encouraged, put the eggs into her bag and hurried her steps towards King Charming's kingdom. After walking on for 8 days and 8 nights, she came at last to a tremendously high hill of polished ivory, so steep that it was impossible to get a foothold on. Fiordalisa tried 1,000 times and scrambled and slipped, but always in the end found herself exactly where she had started from. At last she sat down at the foot of it in despair, then suddenly bethought herself of the eggs. Breaking one quickly, she found in it some little gold hooks, and with these she fastened to her hands and feet. She mounted the ivory hill without further trouble, for the little hooks saved her from slipping. As soon as she reached the top, a new difficulty presented itself, for all the other side, indeed the whole valley, was one polished mirror, in which thousands and thousands of people were admiring their reflection. For this was a magic mirror, in which people saw themselves just as they wished to appear, and pilgrims came to it from the 4 corners of the world, but nobody had ever been able to reach the top of the hill. And when they saw Fiordalisa standing there, they raised a terrible outcry, declaring that she had set foot upon the glass, she would break it into pieces. The queen, not knowing what to do, for she saw it would be dangerous to try to go down, broke the second egg, and out came a chariot, drawn by 2 white doves. And Fiordalisa got into it, and was floated safely away. After a night and a day, the doves alighted outside the gate of King Charming's kingdom. Here the queen got out of the chariot, and kissed the doves and thanked them. And with a beating heart she walked into the town, asking the people she met where she could see the king. But they only laughed at her, crying, "See the king? And pray, why do you want to see the king, my little kitchen maid? You had better go and wash your face first. Your eyes are not clear enough to see him." For the queen had disguised herself and pulled her hair down about her eyes, that no one might know her. And they could not tell her. So she went on farther, and presently asked again, and this time the people answered that tomorrow she might see the king driving through the streets with the princess Storyteller, as it was said that at last he had consented to marry her. This was indeed terrible news for Fiordalisa. She had come all this weary way to find Storyteller had succeeded in making King Charming forget her. She was too tired and miserable to walk another step, so she sat down in a doorway and cried bitterly all night long. As soon as it was light, she hastened to the palace, and after being sent away 50 times by the guards, she got in at last, and saw the thrones were set in the great hall for the king and Storyteller, who was already looked upon as queen. Fiordalisa hid herself behind a marble pillar, and very soon saw Storyteller make her appearance, richly dressed and ugly as ever. And with her came the king, more handsome and splendid than even Fiordalisa had remembered him. When Storyteller had seated herself upon the throne, the queen approached her. "Who are you, and how dare you come near my high mightiness upon my golden throne?" said Storyteller, frowning fiercely at her. "They call me a little kitchen maid," she replied, "and I come to offer some precious things for sale." And with that she reached into her old sack and drew out the emerald bracelets King Charming had given her. "Oh, said Storyteller, "these are pretty bits of glass. I suppose you should like 5 silver pieces for them." "Show them to someone who understands such things, madam," answered the queen. "After that we can decide upon the price." Storyteller, who really loved King Charming as much as she could love anybody, was always delighted to get a chance of talking to him. Now showed him the bracelets, asking how much he considered them worth. As soon as he saw them, he remembered those he had given as ones to Fiordalisa, and turned very pale and sighed deeply, and fell into such a sad thought that he quite forgot to answer her. Presently she asked him again, and then he said, with great effort, "I believe these bracelets are worth as much as my kingdom. I thought there was only one such pair in the world, but here, it seems, is another." Then Turritella went back to the queen and asked her what was the lowest price she would take for them. "More than you would find it easy to pay, madam," she answered. "But if you will manage for me to sleep one night in the Chamber of Echoes, I will give you the emeralds." "By all means, my little kitchen maid," said Turritella, highly delighted. The king did not try to find out where the bracelets had come from, not because he didn't want to know, but because the only way he would have been able to ask Turritella, and he disliked her so much that he never spoke to her if he could possibly avoid it. It was he who had told Fiordalisa about the Chamber of Echoes, when he was a bluebird. There was a little room below the king's own bedchamber, and it was so ingeniously built that the softest whisper in it was plainly heard in the king's room. Fiordalisa wanted to reproach him for his faithlessness, and could not imagine a better way than this. So, when, by Turritella's orders, she was left there to begin to weep and lament, and never ceased until daybreak. The king's pages told Turritella, when she asked them, what a sobbing and sighing was that they had heard, and she asked Fiordalisa what that was all about. The queen answered that she was often dreamed and talked aloud. But by an unlucky chance the king heard nothing of this, for he took a sleeping draught every night before he lay down, and he did not wake up until the sun was high. He didn't want to see his queen. The queen passed the day in great disquietude. "If he did hear me," she said, "could he remain so cruelly indifferent? But if he did not hear me, what could I do to get another chance? I have plenty of jewels, it is true, but nothing remarkable enough to catch Turritella's fancy." Just then she thought of the eggs, and broke one, out of which came a little carriage of polished steel ornamented with gold, and drawn by 6 green mice. The coachman was a rose-colored rat, and a postilion a gray one, and the carriage was occupied by the tiniest, most charming figures, who would dance and do wonderful tricks. Fiordalisa clapped her hands and danced for joy when she saw the triumph of magic art, and as soon as it was evening, went to the shady garden path down which she knew Turritella would pass. And then she made the mice gallop, and the tiny people show off their tricks, and sure enough, Turritella came, and at the moment she saw it, she cried, little kitchen maid, what will you take for your mouse carriage?" And the queen answered, "Let me sleep once more in the Chamber of Echoes." "I won't refuse your request, poor creature," said Turritella condescendingly, and then she turned to her ladies and whispered, "The silly creature does not know how to profit by her chances, so much the better than me." When night came, Fiordalisa said all the loving words she could think of, but alas, no better success than that before, for the king slept heavily after his draught. One of the pages said, "That peasant girl must be crazy," but another answered, "Yes, she says she sounds very sad and touching." As for Fiordalisa, she thought the king must have a very hard heart if he could not hear how she grieved, and yet pay no attention. But she had one more chance. On the breaking of the last egg, she found, to her great delight, that it contained a more marvelous thing than ever. It was a pie made of 6 birds, cooked to perfection, and yet they were all alive and singing and talking. And they answered questions and told fortunes in the most amusing way. Taking this treasure, Fiordalisa once more set herself to wait in the great hall, through which Turritella was sure to pass. And as she sat there, the king's pages came by and said to her, "Well, kitchen maid, it is a good thing that the king always takes a sleeping draught, for if not, he would have been kept awake all night by your sighing and lamenting." Then Fiordalisa knew why the king had not heeded her, and taking a handful of pearls and diamonds out of her sack, she said, "If you can promise me that tonight the king shall not have a sleeping draught, I will give you all these jewels." "Oh, I promise that willingly," said the page. At this moment Storyteller appeared, and at the first sight of the savory pie, with all the pretty little birds all singing and chattering, she cried, "That is an admirable pie, little kitchen maid. Pray, what will you take for it?" "The usual price," she answered, "to sleep once more in the Chamber of Echoes." "By all means, only give me the pie," said the greedy Turritella. And when night was come, Queen Fiordalisa waited until she thought everybody in the palace would be asleep. And then she began to lament as before. "Charming," she said, "what have I ever done that you should forsake me and marry Turritella? If you only could have known how I suffered, and what a weary way I have come to seek you." Now, the page had faithfully kept his word, and had given Charming a glass of water instead of his usual sleeping draught. So he lay there wide awake, and heard every word Fiordalisa said, and even recognized her voice, though he could not tell from where it came. "Ah, princess," he said, "how could you betray me to our cruel enemies when I loved you so dearly?" Fiordalisa heard him, and answered quickly, "Find out the little kitchen maid, and she will explain everything." And then the king, in a great hurry, sent for his pages and said, "If you can find the little kitchen maid, bring her to me at once." "Nothing could be easier, sire," they answered, "for she is in the Chamber of Echoes." The king was very much puzzled when he heard this. How could the lovely Princess Fiordalisa be a little kitchen maid? Or how could the little kitchen maid have Fiordalisa's voice? So he dressed hastily and went down to the little secret staircase which led to the Chamber of Echoes. There, upon a heap of soft cushions, sat his lovely princess. She had laid aside all of her ugly disguises and wore the white silken robe, and her golden hair shone in the soft lamplight. The king was overjoyed at the sight, and rushed to throw himself at her feet, and asked her 1,000 questions without giving her time to answer one of them. Fiordalisa was equally happy to be with him once more, and nothing troubled them but the remembrance of the fairy Mozilla. But at this moment in came the enchanter, with the famous fairy, the same in fact who had given Fiordalisa the eggs. After greeting the king and queen, they said that they were united in wishing to help King Charming. The fairy Mozilla had no longer any power against him, and he might marry Fiordalisa as soon as he pleased. The king's joy may be imagined, but as soon as it was day, the news was spread throughout the palace, and everybody who saw Fiordalisa loved her directly. When Turritella heard what had happened, she came running to the king. When she saw Fiordalisa with him, she was terribly angry. But before she could say a word, the enchanter and the fairy changed her into a big brown owl, and she floated away out of one of the palace windows, hooting dismally. Then the wedding was held with great splendor, and King Charming and Queen Fiordalisa lived happily ever after. And that was almost an hour-long story. Well, over an hour-long story, sort of. But that's the very first story out of the Green Fairy book. How many pages was that one? Let's see. Oh, well, that could explain why. It was 31 pages. This one definitely has longer stories in it than the other two did. And thank you for the hydrate, Matsu. I did take a drink while I was doing that. And I think I've stretched twice just trying to get comfortable. Hey, only got half an hour left. Yeah. Seemed appropriate to read the half check. Oh, let me go and get into that one since I've already got the page open. So our next, not nearly as long story, is The Half Chick. Once upon a time there was a handsome black Spanish hen who had a large brood of chickens. They were all fine, plump little birds except the youngest, who was quite unlike his brothers and sisters. In fact, he was such a strange, queer-looking creature that when he first chipped his shell, his mother could scarcely believe her eyes. He was so different from the 12 other fluffy, brown, downy, soft little chicks who nestled under her wings. This one looked as if he had been cut in two. He had only one leg, and one wing, and one eye, and he had half of a head and half of a beak. His mother shook her head sadly as she looked at him and said, "My youngest born is only a half-chick. He can never grow to be half handsome cock as his brothers. They will go out into the world and rule over poultry yards of their own, and this poor little fellow will always have to stay home with his mother." And she called him Medio Pollito, which is Spanish for half-chick. Now, though Medio Pollito was an odd, helpless-looking little thing, his mother soon found that he was not at all willing to remain under her wing of protection. Indeed, in character, he was unlike his brothers and sisters as he was in appearance. They were good, obedient chickens, and when the old hen checked after them, they chirped and ran back to her side. But Medio Pollito had a roving spirit, in spite of his one leg, and when his mother called him to return to the coop, he pretended he could not hear, because he only had one ear. When she took the whole family out for a walk in the fields, Medio Pollito would hop away by himself and hide among the Indian corn. Many and anxious minutes his brothers and sisters had looked for him, while his mother ran to and fro cackling in fear and dismay. As he grew older, he became more self-willed and disobedient, and his manner to his mother was often very rude, and his temper to the other chickens was very disagreeable. One day he had been out for a longer expedition than usual in the fields. On his return he strutted up to his mother with a peculiar little hop and kick, which was his way of walking, and cocking his one eye at her in a very bold way, he said, "Mother, I'm tired of this life in the dull farmyard, and nothing but dairy maize to the field look at. I'm off to Madrid to see the king." "To Madrid, Medio Pollito?" exclaimed his mother. "Why, you silly chick, it would be a longer journey for a grown-up cock, and you poor little thing like yourself would be tired just before you went to half the distance.
No, no, stay at home with your mother, and someday when you are bigger we will go on a little journey together.
But Medio Pollito made up his mind and would not listen to his mother's advice, nor to the prayers and entreaties of his brothers and sisters.
What use is it of crowding each other up in this little poky place, he said. When I have a fine courtyard of my own in the king's palace, I shall perhaps ask some of you to come and pay a short visit.
And scarcely waiting to say goodbye to his family, away he stumped down the high road that led to Madrid.
Be sure you are kind and civil to everyone you meet, called out his mother, running after him.
But he was in such a hurry to be off that he did not wait to answer or even look back. A little later in the day, as he was taking a shortcut through a field, he passed a stream. Now the stream was all choked up and overgrown with weeds and water plants so that the waters could not flow freely. "Ooh, Medio Pollito," it cried as a half-chick hopped along its bank. "Do you come and help me by clearing away these weeds?"
Help you indeed,
exclaimed Medio Pollito, tossing his head and shaking a few feathers of his tail.
Do you think I have nothing to do but waste time on such trifles? Help yourself, and don't trouble busy travelers. I'm off to Madrid to see the king.
And hoppity-kick, away stumped Medio Pollito. A little later he came to a fire which had been left by some gypsies in the wood. It was burning very low and would soon be out.
"Oh, Medio Pollito,"
cried the fire in a weak, wavering voice which was half-chick approached.
"In a few minutes I will be out, unless you put some dry sticks and leaves upon me. Do help me or I shall die." "Help you indeed," answered Medio Pollito. "I have other things to do. Gather sticks for yourself and don't trouble me. I'm off to Madrid to see the king."
Then hippity-kick, away stumped Medio Pollito. The next morning he was getting near Madrid. He passed a large chestnut tree whose branches the wind caught and entangled. "Oh, Medio Pollito," cried the wind, "do hop up here and help me get free of these branches. I cannot come away, and they are so uncomfortable."
"It's your own fault for going there," answered Medio Pollito. "I can't waste all my morning stopping here to help you. Just shake yourself off, and don't hinder me, for I am off to Madrid to see the king."
And hoppity-kick, away stumped Medio Pollito in great glee, for the towers and roofs of Madrid were now in sight. When he entered the town, he saw before him a great splendid house with soldiers standing at the gates. This, he knew, must be the king's palace, and he determined to hop up to the front gate and wait there until the king came out. But as he was hopping past one of the black windows, the king's cook saw him. "Here's everything I want," he exclaimed, "for the king has just sent a message to say that he must have chicken broth for his dinner." And opening the window, he stretched out his arm, caught Medio Pollito, and popped him down in the broth pot that was standing near the fire. Oh, how wet and clammy the water felt as it went over Pollito's head, making his feathers cling to his side.
"Water, water!" he cried in despair. "Do have pity on me, and do not wet me like this."
"Oh, Medio Pollito," answered the water, "you would not help me when I was a little stream away in the fields. Now you must be punished." Then the fire began to burn and scald Medio Pollito, and he danced and hopped from one side of the pot to the other, trying to get away from the heat and crying out in pain.
"Fire, fire, do not scorch me like this. You can't think how it hurts."
"Ah, Medio Pollito," answered the fire, "you would not help me when I was dying away in the wood. You are to be punished." At last, just as the pain was so great that Medio Pollito thought he must die, the cook lifted up the lid of the pots to see if the broth was ready for the king's dinner.
"Look here!" he cried in terror. "This chicken is quite useless. It's burnt to a cinder. I can't send it up to the royal table."
And opening the window, he threw Medio Pollito out into the street. But the wind caught him up and whirled him through the air so quickly that Medio Pollito was scarcely able to breathe, and his heart beat against the side of his side until he thought he would break.
"Oh, wind!" he at last gasped out. "If you hurry me along like this, you'll kill me. Do let me rest for a moment, or—"
But he was so breathless that he could not finish his sentence.
"Ah, Medio Pollito," said the wind. "When I was caught in the branches of the chestnut tree, you would not help me. Now you are punished."
And he swirled Medio Pollito over the roofs of the houses until they reached the highest church in town. And there he left him fastened to the top of the steeple. And there Medio Pollito stands to this day. And if you go to Madrid and you walk through the streets till you come to the highest church, you will see Medio Pollito perched on his one leg on the steeple, and with one wing drooping at his side, and gazing sadly out of his one eye out over the town. The real question is whether vanity can cause... Never mind. They turned him into a weather vane. And thank you for the hydrate, Aldrin. That's definitely an interesting story of how a weather vane came about. I don't think I'd had any Spanish stories before. That was pretty good. Okay. I could probably read about that one in Spanish if I had it in Spanish. Okay, what's this next one? How long is it? 14 pages. Yeah, I'll do it. Medio Pollito. At least the names in that one I can pronounce. Okay. Ooh. Next one's an Arabic tale. Nice. The next story for this wonderful Friday night of fairy tales. The story of Caliph Stork. Another drink. Okay. Thank you for the stretch, too. Everyone should have a drink. Okay. So anyway. Oh, got ear scratches, too. Okay. The story of Caliph Stork. Caliph Qasid of Baghdad was resting comfortably on his divan one fine afternoon. He was smoking a long pipe, and from time to time he sipped a little coffee which a slave handed to him. And after each sip he stroked his long beard with an air of enjoyment. In short, anyone could see that the Caliph was in excellent humor. This was, in fact, the best time of day in which to approach him, for just now he was pretty sure to be both affable and in good spirits, and for this reason the Grand Vizier Mansur always chose this hour in which to pay him his daily visit. He arrived as usual this afternoon, but contrary to his usual custom, with an anxious face. The Caliph withdrew his pipe for a moment from his lips and asked, "Why do you look anxious, Grand Vizier?" The Grand Vizier crossed his arms on his breast and bent low before his master and answered, "O Lord, whether my countenance be anxious or not, I know not, but down below in the court of the palace is a peddler with such beautiful things that I cannot help feeling annoyed at having so little money to spare." The Caliph, who had wished for some time past to give his Grand Vizier a present, ordered his slave to bring a peddler before him at once. The slave soon returned, followed by the peddler, a short, stout man with a swarthy face and dressed in very ragged clothes. He carried a box containing all manners of wares, strings of pearls, rings, richly mounted pistols, goblets, and combs. The Caliph and his vizier inspected everything, and the Caliph chose some handsome pistols for himself and Mansur, and a jeweled comb for the vizier's wife. Just as the peddler was about to close his box, the Caliph noticed a small drawer, and asked if there was anything else in it for sale. The peddler opened the drawer and showed them a box containing a black powder, and a scroll written in strange characters which neither the Caliph nor the Mansur could read.
"I got these 2 articles from a merchant who had picked them up in the streets of Mecca," said the peddler. "I do not know what they contain, but they're of no use to me. You are welcome to have them for a trifle."
The Caliph, who liked to have old manuscripts in his library, even though he could not read them, purchased the scroll and the box, and dismissed the peddler. Then, being anxious to know what might be in the contents of the scroll, he asked the vizier if he did not know anyone who might be able to decipher it. "Most gracious lord and master," replied the vizier, "near the great mosque lives a man called Selim the Learned, who knows every language under the sun. Send for him. It may be that he is able to interpret these mysterious characters." The learned Selim was summoned immediately. "Selim," said the Caliph, "I hear you are a scholar. Look well at the scroll and see whether you can read it. If you can, I will give you a robe of honor, but if you fail, I will order you to receive 12 strokes on your cheeks, and 25 on the soles of your feet, because you have been falsely called Selim the Learned." Selim prostrated himself and said, "Be it according to your will, O master." Then he gazed long at the scroll, suddenly exclaimed, "May I die, oh my lord, if this isn't Latin!" "Well," said the Caliph, "if it is Latin, let us hear what it means." So Selim began to translate. "Thou who mayest find this, praise Allah for his mercy. Whoever shall snuff the powder in this box, and at the same time shall pronounce the word Motabar, can transform himself into any creature that he likes, and will understand the language of all animals. When he wishes to resume his human form, he has only to bow 3 times towards the east, and repeat the same word. Be careful, however, when you wearing the shape of some beast or bird, not to laugh, or that will certainly forget the magic word and remain an animal forever." When Selim the Learned had read this, the Caliph was delighted. He made the wise man swear not to tell the matter to anyone, gave him a splendid robe, and dismissed him. Then he said to his vizier, "That's what I call a good bargain, Mansur. I'm longing for the moment when I can be some animal. Tomorrow morning I shall expect you early. We will go into the country, take some of the snuff from my box, and then hear what is being said in the air, earth, and water." The next morning, Caliph Qasid had barely finished dressing and breakfasting when the Grand Vizier arrived, according to orders, to accompany him on his expedition. The caliph struck the snuff box in his girdle, and having desired his servants to remain at home, started off with the Grand Vizier only and his attendants. First they walked through the palace gardens, but they looked in vain for some creature which could tempt them to try their magic powder. At length the vizier suggested going further to a pond which lay beyond the town, and where he had often seen a variety of creatures, especially storks, whose grave, dignified appearance and constant chatter had often attracted his attention. The caliph consented, and they went straight to the pond, and as soon as they arrived they remarked storks strutting up and down in stately air, hunting for frogs, and now and then mounting something to itself. With the prolonged pearl bust of each of their bills, and as it were some time before they would recover their composure, the caliph was the first to collect himself. "That was the best joke," he said, "I've ever seen. It's a pity the stupid creatures are scared away by our laughter, but no doubt they would have some next." Suddenly, however, the vizier remembered how strictly they had been warned not to laugh during the transformation. At once he communicated his fears to Caliph, who exclaimed, "By Mecca and Medina, it would have indeed proved a poor joke if I were to remain a stork for the remainder of my days. Just try to remember the stupid word. It has slipped my memory. We must bow 3 times eastward and say, moo, moo, moo." They turned east and fell bowing till their beaks touched the ground. But oh horror, the magic word was quite forgotten. And however often the caliph bowed, and however touching his vizier cried, "Moo, moo," they could not remember it. The unhappy Qasid and Mesmer remained storks as they were. Okay, I'm going to start this one over again. At least from... Somehow, pages stuck together and I skipped some. I hate when that happens. And I'm horrible at editing, so I will start over. Or I could wait until next week and do it again. I don't know. I'll go ahead and do it this week. Sorry, everyone. But there were like 3 pages stuck together on that, and I don't want to mess with that. Especially since I couldn't remember the word, and I only noticed the pages were stuck together when I was flipping back trying to find it. But that is one of the problems with old books. Pages stick together. Still, we got 2 stories done in the introduction, so that's not that bad. And I finished off one of my bottles, so. Let's see who's on that we can read. Or if anyone has any suggestions, by all means, shout it out. Well, we can say we're officially into the Green Fairy book, so that much is good. Let's see. How long has Waste been on today? Or is he still on? He was on before I started. Of course, now my computer's freezing up, so. My computer is freezing. Keep waiting for to get past the ads and waste stream so I can see what he's doing. Okay, he's actually playing a game. What's Legacy doing? It's just chatting, so. Oh, wait, well, it's on. Did it actually say it was on? Did I show up on the billboard? Okay. One board. Yes, okay. Did show up on the bulletin board. Nice, okay. So what is he doing? Come on, screen load. Norse mythology. She's still Lost God, isn't she? A Forgotten God. Okay. Yeah, I'll read it to her. So. Follower raid message. Subscriber raid message. Bookish. Did I spell it right the first time around? I'll be surprised if I did. Oh, cool, it worked. So, thank you everyone for coming in. I apologize for cutting it short, but that other story was going to drive me crazy and I didn't want to restart it immediately, so. I hope you all have a good night and a good weekend, and I will see you next Thursday for more Sherlock Holmes, if not sooner. So have a good afternoon, good evening, and good night, everyone. And I'll see you over in Legacies. Maybe.